July is right around the corner, and of course for all Americans, the 4th of July is the American Independence Day, where we do celebrate being American, which is pretty dang cool. And of course for World of Tanks Blitz on the 4th of July, they usually like to celebrate it as well by bringing out a bunch of bundles, and of course the main Independence Day tanks like the T28 HTC, the T-34 1776, last year we had the Chrysler K, the Super Pershing, and then this year we are expecting the TS-5, Tier 8 American Tank Destroyer, to be dropping as the special Independence Day vehicle. I'm going to be talking about the T28 HTC in today's video. The T-34 1776 isn't really anything special, it's just a T-34 reskinned, and it's pretty dang expensive sometimes. So normally if you have the T-34, or you don't, just wait for the T-34 bundle to come out. But I will be talking about the T28 HTC, and as well we'll be breaking into the statistics of the TS-5, talking about the strengths and weaknesses, everything you need to know about the vehicle. So without further ado, let's get straight into the video. Now starting off with the HTC, what is good and what is bad about this tank? Well, it's actually a pretty strong vehicle. You're going to see in this battle here against Tier 7 and Tier 6 opponents, and they do have some pretty good Tier 7s. They got the Smasher, T25 AT, they've got a T28 HTC, and even a Tier 6 tank that's very deadly, the SU-100Y. The way to think of the T28 HTC is not like the T28 Tier 8 tank destroyer. It's more like, kind of like an AT-15, where it's got very, very strong frontal armor. In fact, the upper plate, or should I just say, the frontal plate, bar, or whatever you want to call it, is 200 millimeters base, 202 base. That is incredibly thick. When you think about it, that means that no Tier 7 mediums are going to be penning that unless you're special, like let's say the T-34-100 or the T-34-1. Most of them, like the Comet, these vehicles don't have the most premium pen, so they will struggle to penetrate the frontal armor. Especially if you're angling this vehicle using the, I think, 30 or 35 degrees of gun arc it has, which is insane. You can see there, that's a good example of that gun arc. It's able to get really, really far to the side. If you're angling this tank like this, that frontal plate becomes way thicker because, of course, it's flat. So what that means is that Tier 7s are going to have an incredibly hard time penetrating you, especially if they're not running calibrated shells, which you normally wouldn't, of course, at such a low tier. So you're going to see what this tank is capable of doing. Now, when it first came into the game on, I think, the second Independence Day special Wargaming had, it was not the best of tanks. It wasn't bad, but it definitely had a lot of issues. It was much slower, it had a worse engine power, traverse speed. I think it was even worse on top speed, maybe. I'm not 100% sure on that one, but it was quite slow. Not only was it very slow, but it had much less damage per minute. By the way, this is a good example to show where that penetration is very hard to get through this tank. I've got pretty good premium pen, about 240, 30 millimeters, and I can barely cut through the T28's frontal armor. Barely! And you can see that he's not even angling it, really, so I'm just going to aim at that weak spot, the boob, and finish him off. Now, I do have tanks on my rear, but thankfully I was able to get just away in time to not worry too much about them. The Smasher did bounce a heat shell right on my front, and with that, we've blocked a pretty beefy amount of damage at 765. And that Smasher, oh boy, he's going to meet the DPM that this vehicle carries a pretty solid amount. This is a perfect example, though, to show just how much that gun can arc over. It's incredible, and it can do this to both sides of the vehicle. And what that means is that if you're hiding that track wheel at an angle like this and sticking that gun out around the corner, that frontal plate is about 240 to 50 millimeters effective, which means that basically even a tank like the Smasher is not going to be penning me, as you can see. So because of that, this tank is incredibly strong. It has the ability to bounce a lot of shells and shred enemy opponents. I think it's got around 2700 DPM. It's quite good. Now, there are, of course, downsides. I'm going to stop now before we continue talking about this tank. The good things, it is a non-turreted TD. And with that, if you get behind it, it's quite easy to take out. Now, thankfully, the mobility was buffed a huge amount since the vehicle has originally been released. So you can see here that even though that Tiger was behind me, the Kuromoy mine, I was still able to traverse my tank quick enough to get away from the Peter, the Smasher, and the SU-100Y and deal with the threat behind me. After that, now I'm back into the front line, and we've blocked just about 2,000 damage now, and we're still putting on one heck of a fight from the enemy team. So, the mobility, yeah, it's not great. And the biggest issue I find with this tank is when you play Tier 8s. Most Tier 8s are going to be sitting at around 250 millimeters of premium pen base. Vehicles, maybe mediums won't. You know, your average medium takes about 240 to 250, but even then, the average tier 8 medium is still going to be cutting through your frontal armor. As well, if you know the weak spots on this tank, they are quite easy to shoot, as they are available to shoot at both sides of the tank. So, yeah, it does have weak spots. It has quite big weak spots at that on the side of the tank. The rear is HEable by most vehicles, but I still like it. It's always been an interesting vehicle to me because of how enjoyable it is. But it's not amazing. The tank is fantastic against tier 7s, but against tier 8s, yeah, the premium, it just cuts right through it. IS-3s, any premium tier 8 heavy is going to cut right through the frontal armor. So it's great, but it also has some big disadvantages. But thankfully, the mobility isn't one of them. It goes about 29 kilometers per hour, has a good power to weight, and in this game, we were able to not only block a huge amount of damage, bouncing about half the shells we received, but as well, did about 3,500 damage ourselves. Pretty dang solid, if I do say so, for the T28 HTC. Now we're going to start talking about the TS-5. So before I do get into the actual statistics and as well armor profile of the TS-5, I do have a bit of bad news, and that is just like basically every other tank that has came into the game in the last months, it's going to be coming in crates with a terribly low drop chance, a 5%. Yep, you heard that right. That means that, yeah, getting your hands on this vehicle guaranteed with the charms, it's going to cost you about $100. Not cheap by any means. So my suggestion, as always, is don't buy crates. If you're going to buy them, buy the $5 bundle. If you don't get it, don't spend any more, because at that point, if you continue to not get the tank, all you're doing is giving Wargaming your money and getting literally nothing in return. What I would suggest to do if you really want to get this vehicle but don't have that much money to spend is wait for the tank to come back 5 or 6 months later. It's not like you're on a time constraint, and if you are, then I guess you would get it. But overall, really, I'd suggest to wait. It's in crates, and crates are always a ripoff. They're meant to give you a terrible drop chance. If I told you that you had a 95% chance to die of this medication I'm giving you, you probably wouldn't take it. I'd hope you wouldn't. So that's about the same chance as you have a 5% chance to get this vehicle, a 95% chance to not. Think of it like that. So, yeah. Please don't gamble on the TS-5 and expect you're going to get it. Expect you're not going to get it until you open up $100 worth of containers. Now, the TS-5, statistically, is a very strong vehicle. A bit of backstory is for some reason, Wargaming has decided to not test this tank, which is a terrible decision in my opinion because, well, you're going to see just how strong this tank does look. First of all, it's got very good damage per minute at 3,132. That means that you're easily going to be penetrating and cutting through armor while shredding into your enemy opponents quite easily. Any tier 8 heavy tank, you basically outdamage per minute. And as well, that 258 mil of pen. Ooh, mama, that's pretty dang strong, especially if you're like me and you like to run calibrated. 271 millimeters means, yeah, you're just going to penetrate everything you go up against. Same for the heat. 374 millimeters. I don't know how to put such a strong emphasis on how much pen that is, but basically, the SU-101, I made a video on a couple days back talking about the Object 263 line, and I said the reason the SU-101 has such a poor DPM is because it carries the highest penetration for any tier 8 TD in the game, which is exactly the same on the premium as this tank. 374 millimeters. This vehicle basically carries a T110E5 gun in tier 8 with more damage per minute. Yeah, I really don't know what to say further than that. The gun, it's definitely too much DPM, but we're going to continue looking at the statistics. You can tell me what you think. Now, gun handling and dispersion factors are terrible. It's got a meh aiming time 2.08 seconds, and the dispersion as well is meh. It's not very accurate. It's kind of like the T28 where it's derpy. The gun sometimes will hit its shots, and then others it probably won't. That's something you gotta keep in mind. But thankfully, because this is a frontline tank destroyer, you usually won't have to worry too much about your shells derping out unless you don't aim them at all, because you're gonna have to be aiming judging that your on-movement dispersion is basically worst in tier 8. Kind of up there with like an RHM and an SU-130 PM. Yeah, not good. .250 is terrible. Now, it does have bad rotating turret, but this thing doesn't really have a turret, so you're not going to have to worry too much about that one, and same for after shot. That is not great. Same with the gun depression at 5 degrees. Surprisingly, though, it has the most gun elevation at 20 degrees. Kind of interesting there. You'd think that they'd want to be like the British and give it, 10 degrees of gun depression, but no, seems like we're sticking at 5. Mobility, oh my god, does this tank weigh a lot at 59.36 tons. And what that means is that, yeah, the tank's not super fast. goes 26 kilometers per hour forwards, but that is much faster than a vehicle like the T28, the American tech tree counterpart, that only goes 20. So it is much faster on that aspect, but its power to weight is, yeah, 12.63. It's not great. Now, because it is so slow, you're probably not going to have to worry that much about the power to weight ratio, kind of like a T28 HTC, but yeah, it's not going to be a fast tank. But it's also not going to be incredibly slow like the Tortoise or, you know, the any of the AT series. It will at least be able to get past that 20 kilometer per hour buffer that most the super slow tank destroyers do carry. Traverse speed is poor though, 29.16. Yeah, very, very, very slow. It's basically the same as a WZ-113. So I don't know what to say about this tank overall. It's very, very strong in certain aspects, but it's very poor in others. And to put the topping on the cake, this is the armor profile. Frontally, that is insanely thick. This is a Carnarvon Action 10, and even with premium rounds and calibrated, yeah, good luck penetrating that. 291 millimeters, ranging upwards of 500 auto ricochets. Pretty much the entire upper superstructure of this tank, you're not gonna pen. It's ridiculously strong. The weakest part is about 270. And if it's using that 5 degrees of gun depression, yeah, it's basically impervious to any shells. But that does not mean it doesn't have weak spots. You've got that big lower plate, which sure is strong, but it's not going to be that strong if you load premium with any tier 7 or tier 8. Yeah, easily penning that. And as well, the cupola is only about 113, and that is quite a big cupola at that. So yeah, it's strong. It's going to be very strong, especially if you're using that gun depression at an angle like this. It's going to be incredibly thick. But it does have weak spots, and same for the sides. Yeah, sides are very weak. It's 100 millimeters all over the side, though, which means you will not be able to penetrate high explosive. But the rear, yep, you will be. 52 millimeters there, quite easy to penetrate with any 152s, 120 millimeters. So it does have weak spots, and don't get me wrong, I actually think that overall the tank is pretty fairly balanced. But the issue is, it kind of just makes the T28 useless. It's just a better version of the T28. It's kind of like how the Carnarvon Action 10 is just a flat-out better version of the Carnarvon. It's kind of how this vehicle is. It's faster than the T28. It's basically got more armor. It's got the same gun depression, basically the same DPM. It does have like drawbacks on the aiming time, but overall, yeah, it's just a better T28. So what do I have to say overall about this tank? I don't know. I honestly can't tell you how strong it's going to be, only because of the gun handling statistics. This might be the only balancing factor for the vehicle, because it is very, very inaccurate. Sure, you could say the mobility is, but this tank's not supposed to be fast. It's supposed to be slow. But what I can say is that if the gun is incredibly inaccurate, it probably will be a big balancing factor. But if the gun does hit a lot of its shots, then expect this to be one of the most overpowered Tier 8 TDs in World of Tanks Blitz. Hopefully, all of you enjoyed today's video. If you'd like to see more like it, please consider smashing that subscribe button down below. Of course, if you want to see more like this as well, make sure to keep up to date with the newest information, because tomorrow I'll be talking about the Object 44, 244, whatever it's called, a new Tier 6 Soviet heavy tank, I think it is. Either way, I'll be talking about that tomorrow. Hopefully all of you enjoyed today's video, and yeah, I'll be seeing you in the next one. Bye-bye!